human story is much more mysterious than we've been taught. For more than a quarter of a century, I have been focusing on the possibility of a forgotten episode in human history, of a lost civilization. My evidence suggested very strongly that there had been a global cataclysm somewhere around 10,500 BC. This mass of new evidence comes out on precisely what I was talking about. I was 300 years out. If we were to have another event like the event that happened 12,800 years ago, our civilization would not survive it. All these great buildings, all this tech, we would be gone. Archaeologists should not take the view that they have got a firm and fixed picture of the past, because actually we know so little. What's important is to question prevailing narratives all the time. Really, for thousands of years, human beings have worked with plant medicines. They have been an integral part of human culture. All ancient civilizations were using means to alter consciousness. They were central to some of the best and greatest achievements. Consciousness is a giant mystery. There are lessons we can learn here in this level of vibration. Maybe we should be considering that the depth of human experience is more than just material things and technology and our egos. I think what's needed is a recognition of how incredibly fortunate and blessed we are to live on this beautiful planet. And every minute of every day should be spent caring for it, because if we don't care for it, it won't care for us. It's our choice. Always was, always will be.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of.
I will always love Graham Hancock because he was our first real guest 6.5 years ago when we started the show. We had him right before we went to Los Angeles to be on the Joe Rogan Experience, and we've had him back ever since. This time, Graham is back to talk about America, but America a long time ago, with evidence that the human species was around 130,000 years before in America, and he's got a fascinating book about it. But more importantly, I'm just glad that Graham is here because he nearly died from some seizures about 2 years ago, and he's really been back on this road to recovery. And again, what I love about Graham is that he was always a journalist, he's always questioning science, and he's pushing the envelope on the entire theory and narrative we have about us as humans. So I know you're going to enjoy this episode. As usual, Graham brings it and totally delivers. And of course, here at London Real, we always deliver, especially in the London Real Academy. We're closing out our Speak to Inspire course. 8 weeks, I show you how to get on stage or how to pitch a corporate board or be better in social communication. And of course, very soon, our Business Accelerator is starting. Here's a bit more about what we do on the inside.
London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Graham Hancock, the British journalist and author of numerous best-selling books, which have sold more than 9 million copies worldwide. You specialize in unconventional theories involving ancient civilizations, stone monuments and megaliths, astrological data from the past, and altered states of consciousness. You're best known for your non-fiction investigations of historical mysteries, including the blockbuster book Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995 and its 2015 sequel Magicians of the Gods. Your new book, America Before, The Key to Earth's Lost Civilization, draws on the latest archaeological and DNA evidence to explore the mysteries of the past and the profound implications of how we lead our lives today. Graham, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you again.
It's amazing having you here. I can't wait to talk about so many things about you. It's glad you're here. I'm glad you're here, first of all, because I know a couple years ago you had some interesting, scares with your health.
Yeah, I've had an interesting couple of years health-wise. It's a strange thing, this business of life, because we start out full of strength and youth, and for years, I never questioned my health. I just took it completely for granted that I had been gifted with a fully functional body and able to just get out there and take on any challenge. But as the years go by, the machine begins to wear down a little bit, and then it throws you a curveball. And the curveball that was thrown at me was a series of massive epileptic seizures in 2017, while I was researching America Before. The first one happened in New Mexico, completely out of the blue, totally unexpected. Santa wakes up during the night and finds me not in bed and finds me on the floor in the bathroom with blood pouring out of my mouth. Whisked off to hospital, totally unconscious, whisked off to hospital, sort of brought back to functioning and discharged after 24 hours. But that was a minor one. The really bad one happened in Bath in England, where I live, in August 2017.
How much later? A few months?
So the first one was in May 2017, and the second one was in August 2017. And the one in August 2017 started with a headache, and I'm just lying on the sofa with Santa, and then suddenly I'm gone, and the rest of it is no memory for me. I'm only told about what happened. They have to call. I'm writhing and seizing so violently that they actually have to have 2 ambulance crews to bring me downstairs and out into the ambulance. Apparently I'm roaring in the ambulance. I don't remember anything about this, and the ambulance is shaking from side to side. They take me to hospital. They cannot stop the seizures. I'm in a state of just continuous seizure. And then the doctor takes Santa aside, my wife Santa, and says to her, "It's bad news. We think you're going to lose your husband. And if he lives, he's probably going to be severely brain damaged." As a last resort, they put me in a 48-hour induced coma. They just shut me down completely. And amazingly, I came out of it still functional. I didn't know what had happened. I woke up after those 48 hours and I saw several of my kids standing around the bed. One is my son who's flown from Los Angeles, another's my daughter who's flown from New York. What are they doing? So what's happened to me? I had no idea. It was a very mysterious, very, very strange thing. But I think it was sent to teach me some lessons.
Okay. And what lessons are those, do you think?
Well, the lesson is not to take anything too seriously, actually. That's the problem. You have to be driven and committed to do this kind of research and to make big books, and that's all very well, but it also takes a price from the body. So I'm just trying to be a little bit more laid back in everything that I do and enjoy life.
Right. I mean, look at the size of this book, and when you look at your other books, I mean, you're an intense guy, and we just talked about your writing regimen, which,
Yeah.
as I think we talked about once before, when you go in,
Yeah.
after you've done all of your preparation and research, when you go to write, it's 16-hour days, 7 days a week for up to 6 months.
As long as the book takes. It's possible to spend 3 or 4 years actually writing a book, and I've done that in the past with a book like Underworld that I published in 2002. I allowed the writing to sprawl over a long period. What I found, and it really works for me, is get all the travel and research, the really detailed research, get all that done. Get it thoroughly done and thoroughly in my head, and then sit down and do nothing else but write for as long as it takes. And typically for a book of this length, the actual writing period can be 6 months, but you're looking at 2 to 2.5 to 3 years of research in front of that before the book actually gets writing. But the writing, I like to keep it tight. I like to live with the book. I like to be deeply immersed in the story, not distracted from it in any way. So I just drop emails, I don't take telephone calls, I don't correspond with people. I'm totally there serving the book and living the story. And that works best for me, and I think it works best for the story I have to tell.
Did the writing of this come after your strokes?
It did, and this was an alarming prospect for me. And by the way, not strokes, but seizures.
Seizures. Okay.
Yeah, it's a different matter. I was concerned that I might have lost some memory. I actually did lose some memory in those massive seizures, particularly the ones I had in August in England. And I was concerned that this would affect my writing. But interestingly enough, it didn't. And that, I think, it's helped me to understand the process of writing, which is in a way, it's a kind of download from the cloud. And as long as your connection to the cloud remains solid, it's all right. Everything is okay. And I found that all of the things that I feared didn't happen, and I didn't suffer from lapses of memory that would make it difficult for me to connect the dots in a big picture. Far from it. In a way, I think it opened me up more to that.
Interesting. And is this cloud some collective consciousness? Are there some other things going on besides all of the research and theory?
I'm just not sure what it is, but what I've realized as a writer is the most important thing I can do is get out of my own way. Don't try and overthink it. Do all the groundwork, get that absolutely solid, but when it comes to actually writing, don't overthink it, just let it flow. There's a flow that you get into, and that's what I call the cloud. It's like connecting to something outside oneself. That's where all the information is stored, that's where everything is stored, and it's drawing down from there.
Okay.
Putting it into a picture.
And how is the health now? Is there anything you changed up? Are there any other scares or seizures? It's been a little while now, but...
Yeah. It's iffy, because the fact is I can have another seizure at any time. And I would not like to find myself in that dark place again, because that's all I remember from the 48-hour induced coma is just darkness. I had a near-death experience when I was a teenager. I had a massive electric shock, and that experience was actually filled with light. I left my body, I think I was 19 or 18 years old. I came out of my body, I was up around the light in the kitchen looking down at my body sprawled on the floor. And I just remember thinking, this is really interesting. I wasn't afraid at all. And there was a sense of a vast expanses beyond. And then I was back in my body. I didn't get the tunnel of light. I didn't get the deceased relatives saying it's not your time. Right. I was just back and functional. But when they put me in that induced coma following the seizures, no light, total darkness. It was just like I'd been taken offline, just switched off. And all that comes back to me from it is two things: a feeling of claustrophobia, and of course, a ventilator tube was stuck down my throat, and to wake up with that still down your throat, and you're looking, I'm waking in the night, and then what the fuck is this? What is this? What has happened to me? Very, very strange. So it can happen at any time, but I'm taking quite a number of precautions to try and make sure it doesn't, and I refuse to let it get in the way of my life. I've got stuff to do. I've got books to write. I've got journeys to make, and I've got a family to love. So it's all good, and I just have to embrace it.
Do you think that early near-death experience might have taken you on this path of your life somehow, or to think differently somehow?
I've had a lot of cause to think about that in the last couple of years, and yes, the answer is it did. It definitely did, because right there at a very early stage in my life, I got very clear evidence that we are not our bodies. Yeah, the body is part of us. It's the vehicle that we manipulate and move around this physical universe in, but we are not our bodies, and we cannot be reduced to our bodies. Consciousness is a giant mystery, and I believe it manifests in physical form for certain specific reasons. There are lessons we can learn here in this level of vibration in physical form, where there are direct physical consequences for what you do. Important lessons to learn, but I don't think that's the whole story at all. I think it's just part of a much bigger, much longer journey.
Yeah. Before we jump into this book, and I really want to find out why you wanted to write this and why now as well. And it's a trilogy, right? It's the third one in the series?
Well, I don't see it that way.
Okay.
What I would say is that for more than a quarter of a century, I have been focusing on the possibility of a forgotten episode in human history, of a lost civilization. And undoubtedly, my best-known book in that field is Fingerprints of the Gods, that was published in 1995. And then a series of books after that, The Message of the Sphinx, that I wrote with Robert Bauval, Heaven's Mirror, the big photographic book that I did with my wife, Santha, an enormous book called Underworld that I published in 2002, based on 7 years of scuba diving, looking for structures on the submerged continental shelves that were above water during the last ice age. But what I see it as is a continuing journey. I don't really neatly package it into trilogy. My previous book, Magicians of the Gods, was headlined by my publishers as the sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods, and I think that's fair enough, because that was taking a global frame of reference and looking at all the new information that had come out since 1995. For example, in Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995, I made a very clear statement that my evidence suggested very strongly that there had been a global cataclysm somewhere around 12,500 years ago, 10,500 BC. And that was the central figure in Fingerprints of the Gods, that there had been this event, but I couldn't really say exactly what the event was, that something awful had happened to the world. And I explored quite a number of possibilities in Fingerprints of the Gods as to what that could have been. But what then happened as we come through 2007, 2008, 2010, is this mass of new evidence that comes out on precisely what I was talking about, a global cataclysm. And the dating on it, this is science. This is not some journalist sitting writing a book at home. This is 60 leading scientists in the field of astrophysics and geology, very strongly and firmly presenting evidence of a global cataclysm caused by a comet impact 12,800 years ago. So I was 300 years out in the estimate that I put forward in Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995. And more than 10 years later, science comes back with new information. So I don't see it so much in terms of a sequel as more in terms of following the evidence where it leads. And when the evidence starts to mount and becomes overwhelming, then I will do a book on it.
And I remember you saying before that with every year, we're finding out that things are older than we thought they were.
All the time.
And it always seems to be confirming a lot of what you've been talking about.
I have been blessed in this way.
In the same period of time, because if you had done your research 50 years ago, maybe this wouldn't have been happening.
It would not have been happening, no. And perhaps it would have been impossible for me to do that research 50 years ago. But what happened is that really in 1995, I was treated by the sort of the scientific community as this total outsider. How dare he speak about this? He knows nothing about this. We are the experts, and he's wrong. What's happened since 1995 is that the evidence, drip by drip, has kept on coming in that actually validates what I was saying before. That there are missing episodes in the human story. A huge development was the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, along with others like John Anthony West and Robert Schoch. I'd been arguing for a long time that the Sphinx is much older than it's supposed to be, that we're looking at a 12,000-year-old monument, not a 4,500-year-old monument. And the response of the skeptical community to that was, but if there was a civilization capable of creating something like the Sphinx 12,000 years ago, then they must have created other monuments. And we don't see any big monuments from 12,000 years ago. And therefore, the Sphinx must be the age we say it is. And then what happens? Klaus Schmidt and the German Archaeological Institute discover Göbekli Tepe, and lo and behold, it's 11,600 to 12,000 years old, exactly in the window of the Sphinx. Firmly dated, no dispute about it, a giant megalithic site. And suddenly the notion that the Sphinx is much older ceases to be in left field and starts to become much more central, because we're seeing it's part of a pattern. And that's what's been going on across the whole area that I work in.
Right. And yet some of the critics still say that those are independent occurrences, that it isn't all linked. And I know you were on Rogan with Michael Shermer, and this was part of the dialogue. I remember him saying that these still could be independent. I know that happened about 6 months before some of your medical pieces. What did you learn from that conversation with him and the feedback?
Well, first of all, it helped me to understand that in dealing with history, and particularly in dealing with prehistory, there is a difference, because history is based primarily upon written documents, and prehistory you're dealing with objects, artifacts that are dug up out of the ground. I began to realize how ideological this is, that actually when I'm dealing with academics, with archaeologists or professional skeptics of any kind, I'm dealing with people who already have an ideological position. And that ideological position is confronted by the position I take. So in an ideological war, what you try to do is to destroy your opponent in any way, fair or foul. And it's helped me to understand that there is an ideological war over our past. For example, when it comes to large-scale animal extinctions, which happened at the end of the Ice Age, what they call the megafauna, the mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed tigers, the giant sloths. All of these creatures were in the world until 12,800 years ago, and then they were gone overnight. Very, very radical, rapid change. Now, the mainstream, for some reason in this ideology, doesn't like cataclysms. It doesn't like cataclysmic events. It doesn't want to think that that cataclysms have played a role in the human story. So seeking for a way to explain the disappearance of the megafauna, the natural option for mainstream archaeologists is to say, oh, that was human predation that did it. That was human hunting that did it. And suddenly we're required to picture a group of hunter-gatherers who are so incredibly efficient and so ruthless that they wipe out the entire megafauna of, for example, North America in a matter of months. I don't know any hunter-gatherer community that behaves that way. They respect their prey. They live with them. They codepend upon them. They don't wipe them out. What does wipe them out is a giant comet impact, which melts the ice sheets and causes huge flooding over North America. So there's a tendency in the study of prehistory to want to keep the past kind of nice and calm and just the way it is now. There's even a word for it. It's called uniformitarianism. And it's a doctrine that things should have unfolded in the past, much in the way that we see them unfolding now. So if we don't have any giant cataclysms happening in the Earth now, then there wouldn't have been any cataclysms in the past. And yeah, we know about the dinosaurs and they were made extinct by an asteroid, but that was 65 million years ago. Surely within the human story, there's been no such thing. And as a result, scholars who attempt to investigate the possibility of a past cataclysm often find themselves in the crosshairs of very vicious attacks from their colleagues, as though somehow they're upsetting the apple cart in some way, and as though we shouldn't think about these things. I don't think that it's deliberate, planned censorship.
Right.
I think it's the mindset of the individuals who we have entrusted with interpreting our history for us. And that is a mindset that is troubled by cataclysms. It doesn't want them to have happened, whether consciously or subconsciously, and looks for other reasons to explain why things are the way they are.
Yeah, it's important you say that, because it's not, in your mind, that conspiracy. It's
I
just
don't think so.
a natural tendency for them to shy away from these things.
Yes.
Because also, keeping things in the status quo keeps everything
Yes.
the way it should be.
Yes.
Keeps them in their same jobs, their institutions alive.
Absolutely.
And so they just naturally become uncomfortable
Yeah.
and resist when they hear these new theories.
Very much so. And this is a classic example that I go into in this new book of archaeology going radically, drastically wrong. And it's partly connected to that so-called overkill theory, where the megafauna were supposedly wiped out by this ruthless hunter-gatherer population. And it's an archaeological theory called Clovis first. And it dominated American archaeology for 50 years. The notion that there's a culture that archaeologists call the Clovis culture. We don't know what they call themselves. They're called the Clovis culture because what's called the type site, the classic site that they were at, is near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, in a place called Blackwater Draw, near Clovis, New Mexico. And apparently the archaeologists needed to go to Clovis to get beer, so they called it the Clovis culture.
Okay.
And this Clovis culture, there's no evidence of it in North America before 13,600 years ago. It flourishes for about 800 years, and 12,800 years ago, it vanishes completely from the picture. The position of archaeology for 50 years is those were the first human beings to enter America. No human beings entered the Americas before 13,600 years ago. And those are the same archaeologists who repeatedly called me a pseudoscientist or a pseudo-archaeologist for suggesting other possibilities. But lo and behold, what do we find? Round about 2010 onwards, the evidence becomes overwhelming that Clovis was not first at all, not first by even a tiny margin, a huge margin, first by a huge margin, not 25,000, 35,000, 50,000. As part of the research for this book, I went to the San Diego Natural History Museum and interviewed Dr. Tom Desmarais, who's the chief paleontologist there. The reason I interviewed him was because he'd just had an extraordinary paper published in Nature in April 2017. And that paper documents human presence in North America 130,000 years ago. That's 10 times as old as the Clovis culture. And all archaeologists admit this now, that the Clovis first was a mistake. They got it wrong, completely wrong. Human beings have been in America for much longer than that. But what they don't comment upon is the careers that were ruined as a result. People like Jacques Saint-Mars, who excavated Bluefish Caves in the Yukon. He had his career literally ripped to shreds by his colleagues because he was proposing humans in America 25,000 years ago. He had his research funding withdrawn. He could only continue on his own buck. Nobody was supporting him, but he was right. He was right, and this happens again and again. So when archaeologists of that type say, Hancock is a pseudoscientist, I say, hang on a minute, you guys are the pseudoscientists. You guys sold us Clovis first for 50 years. You guys withdrew funding from research that might have exposed that lie earlier. You wouldn't let it happen. And that's not right. It shouldn't be that way. Archaeologists should not take the view that they have got a firm and fixed picture of the past, because actually we know so little about the past. They should always be saying this is our provisional position, but we are open to other possibilities, Because if they don't say that, those other possibilities are going to come along and kick them in the ass pretty soon. And that's what's happened with Clovis First. And Clovis First is not a small matter, because if human beings have been in the Americas for 130,000 years instead of for 13,000 years, why, there's 100,000 plus years that archaeologists just haven't looked at because of their preconceived notion that there was going to be nothing to find. There was actually a dictum against digging below Clovis levels. You know how in archaeological strata it's like a layer cake, and you have certain levels. And the view was, let's not waste research funds digging below Clovis because we know there was nothing before Clovis. What an idiotic, what a ridiculous position to take. Those archaeologists who did risk it and who dug deeper, like Al Goodyear at Topper in the Carolinas, they found human stuff going back tens of thousands of years earlier. So, I think we're dealing with an ideological discipline, and I think it should be more provisional in what it says and in what it claims, and it should be less despising of people who consider other possibilities, because that's a useful thing to do. It's useful to consider other possibilities, even if they're wrong. Science should never get locked in a narrow channel and say everything outside the bounds of this channel is not subject to investigation. It's really a mistake.
I mean, I was surprised when you went to America with this book, because I thought, what's in America? And because of all of the assumptions I had made and what I had been taught as a kid, the narrative was simple. As little as I knew that there was nothing else there
exactly.
to talk
This was the view, and this is why America is so interesting, because what we have in the Americas, North and South America, is a gigantic landmass, enormously rich in resources, just the kind of place where a civilization could emerge. And then you take the Ice Age and you recognize that for very long periods, the Americas were cut off from the rest of the world, but yet incredibly rich in resources. So now we know that there were human beings there from 130,000 years ago, and we know that archaeologists haven't been looking at what they were doing. Now's the time to ask, what were they doing? What was going on in the Americas in that time? And again, a need for archaeologists to be more humble. How much have they really looked at? Take the Mississippi Valley civilization, which plays an important role in this book. The famous sites are sites like Cahokia or Poverty Point, or the Ohio sites such as High Bank and Newark. Amazing, huge geometrical earthworks, absolutely stunning. But the trouble is that in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, there was massive, large-scale destruction of these ancient monuments. They were not considered to be worth preserving. The needs of agriculture and industry were more important. So what we can say is that round about 90% of the monuments that were in the Mississippi Valley in, say, 1700 are gone now. They're not there. So archaeologists, in drawing their conclusions about that culture, are drawing it on a tiny fraction that's randomly left by chance from the mass-scale wipeout that was caused. And then when the archaeologists come to it with preconceived ideas about what sort of culture it should be, that's another form of censorship that imposes itself upon the past. We should let the past speak for itself.
And was that just human destruction without people thinking about it? Why were they
Well,
destroyed?
I mean, first of all, there was the view. You know, things have changed. We live in a different world today. But America in the 18th and 19th centuries was in an aggressively expansionist, expanding westward, and that involved taking the land of the indigenous inhabitants. Right. Well, if you're going to take away, tens of millions of acres from people and stuff them somewhere else, then you need a good excuse to do so. So what you do is you depict them as savages, and you say that actually we're doing them a favor. There's a quote I put in the book concerning the horrific project called the boarding schools project in America, where Native American children, about 90% of them, were physically removed from their families and stuck in boarding schools in another state, far away, punished if they wore any traditional clothing. Given the whole ideology of Western civilization and encouraged to cut themselves off from their roots. Well, no wonder we're a species with amnesia if we take the entire cultural memory banks of the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas and deliberately wipe them out.
Yeah. And so what are some of the things that we're going to learn from reading this book? What are some of the new insights about both North and South America that we might have just previously assumed what I did? There's not much happening there, not much we can learn.
Yes. Well, there's a whole range of things, actually. The first and most important issue to understand, and I've really done a great deal of work on this, is that North America was at the epicenter of a humongous global cataclysm. And it was particularly bad because it was a comet. The evidence is really compelling on this. Now, there are people who are proposing alternatives. One thing nobody disagrees on anymore is that there was a cataclysm 12,800 years ago. The best case, as far as I'm concerned, is the comet case, and we have a group of more than 60 leading scientists who are making that case very, very strongly in the pages of all the mainstream journals. But we have to consider the nature of that cataclysm. It was very, very odd. At that time, North America had been, and the world actually, had been emerging from the Ice Age for several thousand years. The world had been getting warmer. The ice sheets had been getting shallower. If they were, let's say, 2 miles deep at 21,000 years ago, they were about a mile deep or less by 12,800 years ago. So the world was warming up. And then something radical happens. You get a massive deep freeze that descends on the planet. So the planet goes back into the coldest of the Ice Age, suddenly, literally overnight. And you get at the same time this massive die-off of animal species. And very weirdly, you get a rise in sea level. Now, normally, in an episode of freezing, you would not expect the sea level to rise. What you'd expect that extra water to do is to reform as ice on the existing continental ice caps, but it doesn't. You get a sudden spike, a very rapid spike in sea level right at the beginning of this event. That's very, very puzzling. But what can explain it perfectly, is the impact of several fragments of a disintegrated comet with the North American ice cap. The heat and the shock generated by those impacts releases enormous floods of meltwater, which go where? They pour primarily into the Atlantic Ocean, and there they stop the Gulf Stream in its tracks. The Gulf Stream is part of the central heating system of our planet. It keeps the planet warm. It's part of a global meridional oceanic circulation that goes on, taking warm water from the tropics, bringing it up to the north, putting it down, bringing it round again. It stopped completely for about 1,200 years at the beginning of this episode. And that was caused by that release of meltwater, which is measured in the sea level rise that we see at that time. Recently, just recently, there's been news of the discovery of a very large crater in Greenland, actually 32 kilometers wide. It's been discovered with remote sensing.
I read about that.
And actually, a lot of the evidence for the cataclysmic event that took place 12,800 years ago does come from Greenland. Why? Because they have had permanent ice cover in Greenland for hundreds of thousands of years, right through to today. So they're able to put down big tubular drills deep into the ice and bring up a core which has different chemical elements at different levels. And from that, they can tell what the climate was in the world at that time. And more than that, they can tell, for example, were wildfires burning? Was there a huge amount of, they call it biomass burning going on? That leaves specific chemical signatures in those ice cores in Greenland. The biomass is not burning in Greenland, it's actually burning in North America. But it's carried by the winds, the smoke and the soot are carried by the winds to Greenland and show up there. So we have this discovery of a very large crater in Greenland. We've already had from the ice cores evidence that are called impact proxies. For example, platinum, iridium, melt glass, nanodiamonds. They're caused by the heat and shock of an impact. But now we have a 32-kilometer wide crater in Greenland. The scientists who are working on this regard this as a global event. There's evidence of impacts as far south as Antarctica, as far north as Greenland, as far east as Syria, and right the way across the Pacific Ocean as well. It's a global cataclysm, but the heart of it was North America, and the North American ice cap, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran ice caps were joined to the Greenland ice cap. They were all one thing. So this is, to my mind, is likely to prove to be further evidence of the cosmic nature of this cataclysm that occurred 12,800 years ago. And it's on a scale that, were it to repeat in our world today, which actually is not impossible because the remnants of the original giant comet are still in orbit, and they form a known meteor stream called the Taurid meteor stream, through which we pass twice a year. If we were to have another event like the event that happened 12,800 years ago, I can say with absolute confidence that our civilization would not survive it. It would not survive it. All these great buildings, all this amazing machinery, all this tech, none of it would stand us in good stead. We would be gone as a civilization. It would become a punctuation mark in the human story. And when I look at that scenario, bearing in mind that we do pass through the Taurid meteor stream twice every year, for 12 days in June and for 12 days in November, we pass through it. When I look at that situation, I ask myself, who in the planet today would survive a disaster on that scale? What kind of people would survive it? And I know it wouldn't be me. I know it wouldn't be the majority of urbanites, or indeed scientists, or any of the creations of the modern world. The people who are really fit for survival in a world in turmoil are the hunter-gatherers. They're the meek of the earth, you know, in Namibia, in the Amazon jungle. People whose daily business is survival. They would hardly be knocked sideways by this event. They would just take it in their stride and they would carry on. They would not suffer the psychological damage. Can you imagine the psychological damage of billions of people who are used to living in the comfort of cities, with every necessity laid on for them every day, without any difficulty in acquiring it? That suddenly all that stops. Can you imagine the effect of that on the educated Western mind? It would be extremely bad. But the hunter-gatherers would survive. I think that actually was the case 12,800 years ago as well.
Really?
I think it was the hunter-gatherers who survived and passed on the message. So one part of it is and I've tried to really bring this home, how central America was to this cataclysmic event that took place across the whole world, and then consider what did that obliterate? What did that event obliterate? What did it wipe out from the human story?
Is this the lost civilization? Because you've always talked about this.
You see, when you're looking for a lost civilization, and I mean a civilization, something that we would recognize as a civilization, I'll tell you directly, I don't think they flew to the moon, and I don't think they had airplanes. But I think that we're talking about a civilization more than 12,000 years ago, which was as advanced as our civilization was, say, in the late 18th century or early 19th century. In other words, they could navigate the world. They could explore the world. They could measure the Earth accurately. They had precise astronomy. They could create beautiful maps that were accurate in terms of latitude and longitude. That kind of level of civilization. I think that's what was sitting there. Now you need a place where such a civilization can evolve, and you need to explain why archaeology hasn't found it yet. And I've considered many possibilities over the years. Back in 1995 with Fingerprints of the Gods, Antarctica looked very interesting to me. Later I became very interested in what's called the Sunda Shelf, which is the area of land around what's now the Malaysian Peninsula and the Indonesian islands out to the Philippines. That was a continent-sized landmass that was above water during the Ice Age and is underwater now. Very interesting to look there and see what's going on there. But the one place that nobody ever looked, precisely because of the ideology, precisely because of what we've been taught about the Americas, was the Americas. Right. Nobody looked there. It was not considered worth looking there. And I think that's a huge mistake, because the Americas stand out as a candidate with this amazing richness of resources. And then the second thing, because of the character of the Ice Age, there were long periods when the Americas were cut off from the rest of the world, cut off from the conflicts and the difficulties going on in the so-called Old World. What a beautiful and amazing place for a civilization to evolve, a civilization that was separate, that was different, that had its own way of doing things. That is one of the reasons why I think we need to take America very, very seriously, because we now know that the archaeological story we've been taught about the Americas is complete and utter bullshit from beginning to end. Clovis was not first. Clovis was a latecomer to the Americas. We know that archaeology has not had its eye on the ball because of Clovis. They've not been considering the pre-Clovis ages. It's only now that they're beginning to look at what happened before Clovis. So they've just closed their eyes to all of those possibilities. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the massive destruction that took place in the Mississippi Valley and across the Americas of Native American culture and of Native American memories. So we're left with this puzzling series of mysteries which need to be explained. And as I go through the research, I find certain things ringing bells with me. I'm working in the Mississippi Valley. I'm at Moundville in Alabama, and I'm looking at a notice board. It's just the beginning of my research into this interesting culture in the Mississippi Valley. And the notice board has been put up by the site, and they're telling us about the site. And what they say is that the whole site was about afterlife beliefs, and that it was believed that on death, the soul of the deceased would ascend to the constellation of Orion, and then would pass through the constellation of Orion to the Milky Way, and then would make a journey along the Milky Way where it would face trials and tribulations and be judged on its behavior during life. The weird thing is, that's exactly the ancient Egyptian system of religion. It's exactly the system. It's too detailed to be a coincidence. What is that narrow star shaft in the Great Pyramid doing, if not pointing at the lowest of the 3 stars of Orion's belt? To send the soul of the deceased up to Orion, then indeed a journey along the Milky Way, trials and tribulations, and a judgment. The same story exactly. But how do we explain that? Can it be a coincidence? No, I don't think so. Details are far too complicated. So what's the answer to this? Could ancient Egypt have directly influenced the Mississippi Valley? Well, no, actually, because ancient Egypt has ceased to exist as a civilization by the time that many of the Mississippi Valley sites rose to prominence. Couldn't have happened then. The conclusion I come to is that what we're looking at in both areas, in ancient Egypt and in the Mississippi Valley, is a legacy of ideas from a remote common source, which actually influenced cultures all around the world. And it's why we find these astonishing similarities. I think a deliberate effort was made by the survivors of that cataclysm, those who came from the lost civilization. A deliberate effort was made by them to try to restart their civilization. And they used the hunter-gatherers with whom they coexisted in the world at that time as their seedbed to try to plant and re-establish these ideas. And that's why we find the same ideas cropping up all around the world in cultures that definitely were not in contact with one another. And trying to explain it by direct contact doesn't work. What does work is going far back, 12,000 plus years back, going right back to that time when these ideas were seeded all around the world.